Pressley, and a member opposed. Each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of my amendment to H.R. 1, the For the People Act. H.R. 1 is bold, transformative legislation which fights voter suppression, promotes access to the ballot, cracks down on money in politics, and provides transparency to the American people. Passing this bill has never been more urgent. We must act to protect and preserve our democracy. My amendment gets to the heart of H.R. 1 and recognizes the contributions that young people continue to make to our democracy. By lowering the federal voting age from 18 to 16 years of age, my amendment would enfranchise young Americans to help shape and inform the policies that will set the course for our future. From police violence to immigration reform to climate change to the future of work and minimum wage, our young people are organizing, mobilizing, and calling us to action. They are at the forefront of social movements and have more than earned inclusion in our democracy. Mr. Speaker, 16 and 17-year-olds, constituents of mine, are supporting their families. They are working not for enrichment or to build a resume, but because they have no choice. They are attending school full-time and taking care of loved ones in the midst of the COVID crisis. Young people are contributing both to the labor force and their local economies by paying taxes, and yet they are deprived of the opportunity to exercise their right to vote. Some have questioned the maturity of our youth. I don't. 16 and 17-year-olds today possess wisdom and maturity defined by today's challenges, hardships, and opportunities. They deserve and demand a government that is accountable to them, a government that values their voices and understands the depth and breadth of their lived experience. They are not a monolith, but they are nation builders, living through a global pandemic, confronting racial injustice, and rebuilding our democracy. Now is the time for us to meet the moment and enfranchise 16 and 17-year-olds. I would like to thank my colleagues and dear friends, Representatives Ming and Schakowsky, for their leadership on this issue and for co-sponsoring my amendment. And with that, I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentle lady from Illinois.
The woman is recognized for 1 minute.
First, I want to thank my friend, Ayanna Pressley, wonderful Congresswoman from Massachusetts. I have had the pleasure of knowing Ayanna Pressley well before she was even 16, and she was ready to vote as soon as that. I want to say that all over the country, and especially in my district, I feel we see young people, young activists who are working tirelessly to make their voices heard. From battling climate change, battling gun violence, to advocating for racial justice and economic equality. This is their century, and our national leadership should be accountable to them, to their youth, to these young people in their generation who will be most impacted by the existential threats that are looming before us today. This is a serious proposal. 16-year-olds are doing the work of adults, and they should be treated with the respect that they deserve and the participation that they should be able to have. So I heartily support this resolution, this amendment, and urge my colleagues to consider it carefully and vote for it. Thank you.
Gentlewoman from Massachusetts. Gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to my good friend from the great state of Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank my good friend, Mr. Davis from Illinois. Mr. Speaker, our nation faces serious challenges, including an ongoing pandemic, vaccine distribution hurdles, continued lockdowns from out-of-touch governors, prolonged closures of our schools, and 1 in 4 small businesses face the risk of permanent closure. And at a time when the American people are concerned with election integrity, a top priority of our Democrat leadership is to federalize election laws, removing the authority of state legislators expressed in Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution. H.R. 1, the bill before us today, would allow for taxpayer-funded campaigns through a government match on political contributions at a 6-to-1 ratio. So a $200 contribution would be matched by the taxpayer to the tune of $1,200. H.R. 1 would also hinder the rights of states to determine their registration voting practices, including mandating automatic voter registration. The suggestion being made by my Democrat friends and colleagues that opposition to this legislation is somehow a form of voter suppression is ridiculous. I and my colleagues would never consider engaging in a course of action that would suppress a citizen's legitimate right to vote. This is a partisan power grab that threatens election integrity. One citizen, one vote is my solemn resolve. I oppose this amendment and the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Illinois.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from California.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First of all, let me rise to support the Pressley Ming Schakowsky amendment. I also want to thank Congresswoman Pressley for bringing this forward and to say that you are about the future and really about making sure that civic participation is really enhanced and moved forward by allowing for this amendment to come into this bill, H.R. 1, because this is what it's about. It's about our democracy. And you have been consistent in terms of inclusion and making sure our democracy works. Elections are about the future, and no one has more at stake in that future than our youth. By age 16, we trust our young people with a host of important decisions and responsibilities. It is the moment when lifelong habits are built and when ideas about the world begin to become fixed. Evidence has shown that when people start voting younger, they are more likely to exercise their right to vote as they grow older. Too many of the arguments against lowering the voting age to 16 crumble when you really examine them clearly. Often the objection is simply that 16-year-olds are too young to exercise good judgment. This is really a patronizing thought. In fact, it's downright scary to think that we would have our government policies decide what constitutes as wisdom for our young people. So it's past time for us to elevate voting as one of the central responsibilities of our democracy. I urge an aye vote.
Gentlewoman from Massachusetts.
I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, my good friend, Mr. Calvert.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to an amendment in block number 4 and the underlying bill. I have a long list of concerns with this bill, and at the top of that list is nationwide ballot harvesting. Democrats in California already legalized ballot harvesting in our state, despite our concerns with the practice. Republicans were determined to play by the rules, utilize legal ballot collection methods in the last election. One amendment in this package, offered by my California colleague, puts this hypocrisy on full display. Under current law, with my colleague's amendment, a foreign operative, maybe a Russian operative, maybe a Chinese spy, could still handle ballots for untold numbers of people. My colleague's amendment is a blatant attempt to criticize ballot harvesting only when the other guys do it. In other words, California Democrats think it's fine when their paid operatives collect ballots from strangers and throw them in a bag. But they object when churches try to collect them for members of their congregation and put them in a box. Don't be fooled. Democrats don't want to facilitate ballot collection for all Americans. They just want to make it easier for their operatives to harvest ballots, and will cry foul whenever Republicans try to play by the same rules. I yield back.
Gentleman from Illinois. Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I stand in this chamber today thanks to the young people of Westchester and Rockland counties. When I first ran for Congress, I was joined by a small group of young, committed volunteers. Many of them were not eligible to vote. Many of them were 16 and 17 years old. And my goodness, did they know more about policy and national politics than people who were 4 and 5 times their senior. In this country, when you are 16 and 17 years old, we charge you as an adult. In the courtroom, you're able to drive to the job we expect you to work in order to help support your family. And so I think that the least we can do is give 16 and 17-year-olds a say in who governs them. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from Massachusetts. Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Virginia, another great friend, Mr. Klein.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, the Constitution vests primary responsibility in state legislatures to set the times, place, and manner of congressional elections, allowing states and localities to determine how best to conduct elections to suit the needs of voters in their communities. But the bill before us today, and this amendment also, reverses the longstanding history of state control over the electoral process, makes unconstitutional changes to our election laws through a top-down federal power grab, and places unprecedented limitations on political speech. Rather than strengthening the election process by working with Republicans to find bipartisan solutions, H.R. 1 was written without any input from Republican members. Some of the most egregious provisions include mandating states allow ballot harvesting, mandating same-day registration in all 50 states, abolishing the signature requirements for mail-in ballots, mandating absentee ballots be accepted up to 10 days after Election Day, mandating that states send ballots in the mail proactively, and finally, forcing taxpayers to pay politicians to campaign for office. This bill is nothing more than an attempt by Democrats to cement their fragile and fleeting majorities at taxpayer expense. The bill would limit the free speech of my voters, use my voters' tax dollars to fund candidates, and violate the Constitution by superseding the Commonwealth's ability to determine their own laws on voter eligibility. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this misguided and radical legislation.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Illinois.
Reserve.
Gentleman from Illinois has about 2 minutes left. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts has 15 seconds left. Gentleman reserves.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, in closing, we must do right by the young organizers and activists who have fought for our democracy. They have a stakeholder in our democracy, and they deserve to have a stake at the ballot box. Civil rights heroes like the late John Lewis, who taught us through example, no one is too young to fight for access to the ballot. And in fact, he supported this very amendment last Congress. I respectfully request my colleagues support this amendment, and I yield the balance of my time.
From Illinois, Mr. Davis is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Kentucky, a mediocre friend, not a great friend, Mr. Barr.
The honorable gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After a divisive election season, allegations of election fraud, objections to the Electoral College, and impeachment, a friend of mine on the other side of the aisle recently asked, what would it take to unify our country? My answer is that it's certainly not this legislation, which from my standpoint is the most divisive, unconstitutional, and destructive piece of legislation in my time in Congress. They call it the For the People Act, but it should be called For the Politicians Act, because it would force taxpayers to fund political campaigns, including the campaigns of politicians with whom those taxpayers disagree. Maybe a better name would be the Election Power Grab Act, because it would normalize the chaos, uncertainty, and irregularities surrounding mail-in voting in the 2020 election by centralizing the administration of elections in Washington, D.C., commandeering states to permanently expand mail-in voting without safeguards, legalize ballot harvesting, disregard voter ID laws, permit same-day voter registration without citizenship verification, among other egregious measures. Mr. Speaker, election laws should make it easy to vote and hard to cheat, but this bill would not only make it easy to cheat, it would effectively make it legal to cheat. And at a time when half of Americans have lost confidence in the integrity of our elections, this bill will only drive distrust and division higher. For the sake of ending division in our country, I urge my colleagues to vote no on this power grab of our elections. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Reserve. Reserve.
The gentleman from Illinois has the only remaining time, so you have the right to close.
Oh, then I won't reserve. I'd like to take this time, Mr. Speaker, to yield 1 minute to another mediocre friend from Texas, Mr. Fallon.
The honorable gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Congressman Davis. Listen, I've only been here 2 months, and in that time, I've seen some bad legislation. And to date, this is one of the worst that I've seen. The age of consent has always been and has always coincided with the franchise. And it was for nearly 200 years, it was 21. And then in the 70s, they changed it to 18. Our society has agreed since then for 50 years that 18 is when a child becomes an adult. And I find it interesting that our friends across the aisle don't want to have 16 and 17-year-olds tried as adults when they commit violent adult crimes, and yet they want those 16 and 17-year-olds to have the franchise. And even some, believe it or not, want 16 and 17-year-olds that are convicted of murder to be able to vote while they're in prison after they've been convicted. This is a horrible amendment, and I respectfully request that all of our members join us in voting no. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Good job, Pat.
Pursuant to House Resolution 179, the previous question is ordered on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Pressley. The question is on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The agreement